Shalom Aleichem, welcome. I'm Lisa Newman, the Yiddish Book Center's Director of Publishing and Public Programs. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Yiddish Book Center's virtual theater for tonight's program, The Moss Brothers, How Generations of a Jewish Family Transformed London's Fashion Industry, with Bethan Bide and Lucy Whittemore. Before we get started, a reminder that this program was pre-recorded due to the time difference for our presenters. There won't be a Q&A following the program. If you do have questions, please email programs@yiddishbookcenter.org, and we'll do our best to get back to you with answers. I'm delighted to introduce this evening's program, which is based on the exhibit currently on view at the Museum of London. I'd read about the exhibit and reached out to Bethan and Lucy to ask if they'd present the program for those of us not able to tour the London exhibit. Luckily, they accepted the invitation. And then by sheer luck, the day they were recording this in London, I happened to be there and I got to visit the exhibit as well. It's really a wonderful window into the Jewish immigrant experience in London as seen through the story of the Moss brothers. It's surprising, informative, and a really lovely story, wonderfully told by Bethan Bide and Lucy Whittemore. Bethan Bide is lecturer in design and cultural theory at the University of Leeds. She's a design historian with a particular interest in fashion cities, the production and consumption of ready-to-wear clothing, and the role of fashion in museums. Bethan previously worked as a producer of comedy programs for BBC Radio 4. Lucy Whittemore is fashion curator at the Museum of London and is the lead curator of Fashion City, How Jewish Londoners Shaped Global Style. Lucy has a PhD in First World War fashion from the University of Glasgow. She's published on the topic of First World War morning dress and austerity fashion. Enjoy the program. Email us with questions, and if you find yourself in London anytime soon, plan to visit the museum to see this and the larger exhibit on fashion. And remember, check out our calendar of events to see what's upcoming. There's a lot on the calendar, both live at the Yiddish Book Center, where you can visit our newly opened core exhibition, Yiddish, A Global Culture, and then come to one of our programs. Check out the calendar of events for the live programs, learn about the exhibition, and learn about our upcoming virtual programs. Now, over to the story of the Moss brothers. Enjoy.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're here to talk about the Moss Bros story, the Moss family, in the context of an exhibition and a book, Fashion City, How Jewish Londoners Shaped Global Style. So before we start, we'll quickly introduce ourselves. My name is Dr. Lucy Whittemore, and I am the curator of fashion at the Museum of London, and I am the lead curator for the Fashion City exhibition.
And I'm Bethan Bide. I am an academic and I'm a lecturer at the University of Leeds. And I work with Lucy as the academic advisor to the exhibition Fashion City.
So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the background of Fashion City before we dive into the Moss Bros story. So Bethan and I have been working together as research partners for about 5 years now. And we started this research project back in 2019. We called it the Jewish Fashion Makers Research Project. And what we were interested in was the stories of Jewish people of Jewish heritage working in London's fashion industry. And we were aware that in the Museum of London Fashion and Textile Collection, which is about 24,000 objects, that there were lots and lots and lots of stories of companies or individuals in the fashion industry that had Jewish heritage, but that those stories weren't sort of properly documented. They hadn't really sufficiently been recorded in a way that allowed us to speak about the true extent of the contribution made by Jewish people to London fashion. So we set out to uncover these stories. So we did in-depth object research where both people who are very interested in the details of objects, what objects can tell us. And you can kind of see us in action in these two pictures here at a workshop that we did back in 2022. We also did a lot of social history research. We looked at the sort of geography of the city, of where workshops were, where different businesses were placed. And we connected with modern day Jewish Londoners, people who had that experience of family members who'd worked in the trades. So we sort of wanted to add context to objects that we already had access to in the Museum of London collection, but we also were interested in collecting new stories. And what became clear quite quickly was that there was a certain image that people held of a Jewish person working in the garment industry in London. So a big part of the project early on was all about stereotypes. How do we look beyond the stereotypes? And I'm aware, you know, we're speaking to a largely American audience here. There is a whole other, a huge story about Jewish migrants working in the fashion industry in America. And perhaps some of these same stereotypes would be recognizable there as well. But if you take, for example, this photograph on the slide, so this is a Jewish-owned garment workshop in the East End of London called Schneider's Garment Factory, taken around 1917. And this exact image has been used multiple times to present the idea that this trade was dirty and dangerous, that these workshops were cramped, that they were not sufficiently lit, that they were sort of very crowded, and that the working conditions were very poor. But actually, the research we've been doing does, of course, there are elements of darkness to the story, and they are really, really important to recognize. But there's also a lot more to it. So when we looked into this picture, we found out through our research that this building had actually been purpose designed as a garment workshop, and it was really, you know, up to code in terms of following the kind of the laws of the day into how working conditions needed to be set up. You can see in the roof there are these big skylights providing plenty of natural light, and hanging low over the table, more focused lighting for the workers. If you look closely, you actually realize it's not as cramped as it seems. There's a crowd of people in the back because the camera's out and they're having their photo taken. It's an important moment to record. And actually, when you look in more detail, you can see some of the people are playing around. They're wearing silly bits of garments on their head. Someone's smoking a fake cigar. So it actually paints quite a different picture. So we really wanted to plug into where these stereotypes come from and how do we kind of get past this mythology that says that Jewish people were working in poor and cramped conditions or profiting from people who were working in this way. How do we look at the richer, fuller, truer story? The dress on the right is one of the very first things that we researched. It is made by a woman called Peggy Lewis. She ran her own business. She was a woman who owned her own business. It was in the West End of London, which was seen as much more prestigious. We know that she worked in a beautiful, light, airy workshop. And crucially, she is making bespoke, high-end women's wear with this luxurious beading and embroidery. So everything about that story defies the expected image of who a Jewish fashion maker was. And these were the kind of things that we were setting out to explore. So this research project became an exhibition. We pitched it in 2022 and it opened in October of 2023 at the site, that's the building I'm in right now, the Museum of London Docklands, which is in the Canary Wharf area of London, quite near to the East End. So the museum as a whole really tells the story of this area. So it's really appropriate that we're telling the story in this space. Fashion City, the exhibition, tells all sorts of different stories across the clothing trades, East End and West End, you know, high-end fashion and sort of cheap retail. We wanted to show the breadth, the contribution that Jewish people have made to London's fashion industry across the board. And collectively, all of the different spaces of the exhibition come together to show just how crucial the Jewish contribution has been to making London internationally recognized as a fashion centre. So that gives you just a little bit of background of the kind of research we've been doing. And now we're going to tell you in depth one of our favourite stories from the exhibition, which is the story of Moss Bros.
Yeah, so we wanted to tell this story because Moss Bros is one of the only firms in the exhibition that spans kind of the entire history of the period we're looking at. So from the 19th century through to the 20th century, and actually still in existence today. But we're going to take you back to the start of that story so that you can understand the evolution of this firm, but also how important all of the different people involved were, and kind of how this firm helps us understand the changing experiences of Jewish people involved in the garment trades over the period of time we're talking about. So we're going to start with the founder of the firm, a man called Moses, who was born around 1830. We know that Moses was an educated man. He was a lay preacher at his synagogue. And we also know that by his third wife, a woman called Mary O'Brien, who was from Dublin, he had 5 sons and 3 daughters. So to support this family, he dealt in second-hand clothing. And this was quite a common occupation for Jewish Londoners at this time. It's quite a common way for lots and lots of people to get hold of clothes. In the 19th century and before, when there isn't mass market ready-made fashions, secondhand clothes provide a really important way for people to get hold of new clothes who aren't perhaps wealthy enough to buy a lot of bespoke handmade clothing. So the secondhand trade is a really vital and important part of the fashion industry at the time that Moses is operating in it. And in London, it is very strongly associated with Jewish people. Part of that is to do with the kinds of trades that Jewish people had historically been allowed to be involved in. But it's also to do with the long history that Jewish Londoners have in terms of trade and migration. So they're having lots and lots of international and national networks to draw on. I've popped on the slide here just sort of some of the depictions of secondhand clothes dealing in London around the time we're talking at. So you can see these kind of stereotypical depictions of the Jewish clothesman going and collecting clothes. But I also wanted to include this lovely photograph of Petticoat Lane Market on a Sunday morning. So Petticoat Lane is in the East End of London and is a really important site in the Jewish community in East London at this time, but it's also a really important place for people coming together and buying clothes and getting new fashions. And I love these kind of rails of clothes that you've got hanging up above the crowded market there. So I think you get a sense of the kind of vibrancy of the secondhand clothes trade. When we're talking about secondhand clothes, we're not talking about kind of slightly mangy, nasty things. We are talking about people getting hold of new fashions and it being a really important part of fashion consumption. We know that Moses used to travel far and wide to get hold of the best clothes. So in London, he used the auction room at Debenham. So when they were kind of auctioning off clothes that hadn't been sold, he was kind of a big fan of picking up some lovely pieces there. But he also travelled as far as Edinburgh in order to source them, which from London back in those days was a long trip. And he also went to places in the East End, places around Houndsditch, which were real centres for secondhand clothes dealing. We know Moses was really good at his trade because he was able to set up a series of progressively bigger shops. So he started off around kind of Pentonville and Somerstown, which were perhaps not the nicest areas in London, but he was soon moving down to the West End, and in 1863 he's established a shop on Garrick Street in the West End, so much more fashionable, much more desirable location. And then in 1881, the story of Moss Bros really starts because Moses sets up a new shop, which he calls M. Moss, on King Street in the very fashionable Covent Garden area. And this is the business that becomes Moss Bros. Moses runs it until 1894, when the business is taken over by 2 of his sons, Alfred and George, and they change the name to Moss Bros in 1899. And it's Alfred and George who really make the first kind of big innovations in Moss Bros. So the story of Moss Bros is a story of kind of evolution and change. So Alfred and George come into the business and they have inherited these very strong connections to the secondhand clothes trade, really good networks in terms of obtaining secondhand clothes. But they're also aware that the fashion industry is changing in the late 19th century. And there is this new demand for a new type of clothing production, which is ready-made clothes. So people increasingly want to buy these cheaper ready-made clothes rather than buying secondhand. And Alfred and George use their complementary skills in order to expand into this new sector. So Alfred is a really strong salesman. He is really good at kind of persuading people that they want to buy his goods and they want to sell to him. And George, who was deaf, was a really skilled tailor. So George would do things like he would go to Savile Row and buy garments and kind of unpick them and use them as patterns to make new garments. And the brothers would also draw on the skills of Savile Row in other ways. So they would, in the fashionable off season, so the season outside of when everyone was going to London to get their nice clothes, they would use the tailors of Savile Row to make up clothes who were kind of out of work waiting for the next season to come along. So they would kind of use those skills to make ready-made clothes that they could sell. And they really changed perception of ready-made clothing amongst the kind of middle and upper classes. It had always been seen up to this point as being very much something for the working classes. And the way that they were using offcuts of luxury fabrics that they were obtaining, they were using these really skilled Savile Row tailors in their making. They really focused on producing high quality tailored ready-made clothes that could kind of compete with those bespoke clothes. Lucy, I don't know if you want to say something about one of those examples.
Yeah, so this is a really special object. So this is one of the garments that features in quite early on in the Fashion City exhibition, and it's also discussed in the Fashion City book. So this is a very rare example of Moss Bros tailoring from this time. We have not been able to identify any other pieces of Moss Bros tailoring from so this dates between about 1905 and 1910. So it's the period that the company was being overseen by Alfred and George, Moses's sons. And it really speaks to that relationship they had with the sort of more elite menswear tailoring in London. We can see that they're borrowing techniques, they're borrowing style when they made this Chesterfield coat from those kind of Savile Row tailors. So it's a really important object for that reason, but it also has a really nice story behind it as how it came to be a part of our collection here at the Museum of London. So you'll soon learn more about Harry Moss, who was a nephew of Alfred and George, who would become the third family member to run the business. And Harry in 1945, so I'm jumping ahead a little bit, published a letter in the Times newspaper offering help to any institution that was interested in building up a collection of menswear clothing. And he wrote that he felt it was an important thing to be acknowledged and preserved of men's tailoring from this period in London. And a little while later, Mr. W.F. Grimes, who was then the director of the London Museum, which was the former name of the Museum of London, responded saying, yes, I'm really interested. If the clothes are still available, can we talk about it? And what happens is that Harry Moss, on behalf of the Moss Bros Company, donated a collection of about 25 pieces of menswear to the London Museum. And these garments dated from sort of the 1880s to the 1930s. And they weren't only from Moss Bros, they were from other London tailors, including Savile Row tailors like Mayer and Mortimer and Henry Poole. So it shows sort of who they were looking to, who they were borrowing ideas from, who they were possibly wearing. We don't know, but we think this might have been part of Harry's personal wardrobe. So it's really nice that is how this collection came to us. And what my favorite thing is, at the end of the exchange of letters that we have in our archive, Mr. Grimes writes to Harry Moss saying, I hope this will be just the start of the Moss menswear collection at the London Museum. So it feels really special to sort of honour the connection that those two men made by researching them and talking about them today.
Absolutely. So let's kind of, I guess, find out a little bit more about Harry. Let's talk a bit about what happens next with the evolution of the firm. So we've talked a bit about this expansion into ready-made tailoring, and this is something that Moss Bros continues to do in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. And they are really impressive in the way that they spot opportunities and respond to changing circumstances. So a nice example of this is that they anticipate when the First World War breaks out, that there's going to be this real need for lots and lots of military uniforms. So they expand their production into military uniforms, and that's an enormous financial boost for the firm. It's sort of estimated that their value increases from about £10,000 in 1914 to about £80,000 in 1919. So you can see that they're both very good at producing this great quality clothing, but also excellent at sort of spotting opportunities and responding to a changing market. And one of the ways that they do this is they draw on the skills of London's Jewish migrant community, particularly in the East End of London, to expand their tailoring operations. So between 1880 and 1914, there is quite a large wave of migration from Eastern Europe to London and other places, including New York. And many of those people work in tailoring, and many of those people are really important in kind of the development of British ready-made tailoring. They develop new ways of doing things and new skills. And Moss Bros spots that there is a real skills hub in the East End for this kind of ready-made tailoring, and they use it. So in particular, they hire two really key figures to help them with their expansion into ready-to-wear. So the first of those is a man called Sol Dubensky, who cut the coats, so does the pattern cutting for all their coats and jackets. And also Sam Levy, who made the trousers. And Sam's a really interesting example of how Moss was very good at taking people with skills and kind of giving them opportunities to develop those skills and making them feel like they were valued members of society, so sort of retaining them in the business. So Sam was born in Poland in 1890, but by the time he's 21, he is established in Whitechapel in East London, and he's working as a fixing tailor. And we can guess that Sam is pretty good at what he does, because by 1921, he's got his own workroom in Mile End making trousers. So he's overseeing other people doing that. And in 1925, Moss Bros employ him and his workroom to make their trousers. And eventually, Sam Levy ends up working in-house at Moss Bros and kind of running their entire trouser making division. And you can sort of really see how they are, as I said, not just spotting opportunities, but also spotting the right people to fulfill those opportunities, spotting where there are skills and making the most of those skills. And I think my favorite fact about Sam is that by the time he retired, it's estimated that he must have made almost 500,000 pairs of Moss Bros trousers. So there must be thousands of people who wore Sam's trousers, which I think is just kind of a lovely fact. I love the idea of all of these people going out in the clothes by this wonderful, wonderful East End trouser maker. So that isn't the only way that the firm expands around this time. They also expand into hiring clothes. And this is something that Moss Bros is really well known for in the UK. But it began perhaps a little bit accidentally. So in 1897, a man called Charles Pond, who had been a stockbroker but found himself out of work and trying to kind of start a different career, finds that he needs something to wear for his new job as an entertainer. But the trouble is, he's a little bit hard up on cash, and he has pawned his own dress suit. So Alfred Moss lends him a set of tails, so an appropriate dress suit to wear for this kind of occasion for him to do his entertaining job. And the entertaining job goes really well. Charles lands a set of engagements, performing in music halls, and he continues this relationship with Alfred Moss, only he says, I should probably pay you for this now. So he starts paying 7 and 6 pence a night for the clothes that he's hiring to sing in the music halls. And this one-off grows into a much, much bigger venture. And again, particularly in the aftermath of the First World War, when there is increasing shortage of cash amongst the middle classes. There are rising taxes, there are economic issues, and people don't necessarily have the money to go out and buy lots of new formal clothes. So Moss Bros recognise that there's this growing appetite for people to hire formal clothes for them for events. And they hire to all sorts of people. So they hire to the composer Edward Elgar for performing in. They hire to celebrities like the actor Rudolph Valentino. And there's a lovely note in their archives about the fact that they let Rudolph Valentino off the extra expenses that they would normally charge for extra cleaning after he caused a little bit of damage to a dress suit because he was attending a London premiere of one of his films. And there was such an enormous crowd outside wanting to see him that he had to escape over the roof of the cinema in Leicester Square to get away from this kind of excitable crowd. But they also were really, really vital in a lot of kind of quite pivotal moments in British history. So at the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, loads of cabinet ministers and officials wore Moss Bros hire suits, and it was said afterwards that the coronation just wouldn't have been able to go ahead without Moss Bros, that kind of formal event required an institution like Moss Bros to help make sure everybody was outfitted in the right gear. So initially Moss Bros hire is only for men, but in 1947 they launched their ladies hire service, and you can see here they're introducing it, and they're not introducing it. The former editor of British Vogue, Alison Settle, is introducing it. So they're really kind of playing up the high fashion credentials of this. So Moss Bros hire service is offering a way for people to dress in clothes that maybe they wouldn't have access to, but also through that offering them access to high society, giving them the clothes that they need to go to society events and fit in. And this period of expansion that I've just been talking about was overseen by the next generation of the Moss family. And this is a man called Harry Moss. And Harry Moss was no stranger to the firm when he took over. He actually started working at Moss Bros when he was just 13 years old in 1909. We know that Harry Moss was the 4th generation member of the West London Synagogue, so he was very active in his Reformed faith, and he was really supportive of other community groups, so things like the Bethnal Green and Cambridge Boys Club, which was a Jewish boys club in the East End that kind of supported boys and young men. And we know that Harry was incredibly generous to them. The photograph here of the car is Harry loaning his car, his very, very nice car, to an event that they were running, and sort of driving around these East End lads in his very nice car. But we also know that he gave jobs to a lot of these people. So he's kind of very active within different Jewish communities, but also very supportive of trying to kind of help people out and give people a bit of a leg up. We also know that he is really widely loved amongst Moss Bros employees. He is known very affectionately as the governor, and becomes a very popular member of the firm. But he's also quite exacting in his standards. So until he becomes managing director of the firm in 1934, he is working in their ready-made department. And while he was doing that, he used to like to try on every single jacket that the firm made to check it for quality control. So you can see that he has exacting standards. He's really got an eye for detail as well. And I think that eye for detail is really important, because one of the reasons why Harry is so important to the expansion of the firm is that he recognizes it's not just enough to make clothes. You also need to make people want to buy your clothes. You need to sell how exciting and desirable they are. So Harry really understands the fashion system. And one of the things he does when he takes over as managing director is to hire a young expert in marketing called John Cassels. And between them, John Cassels and Harry Moss come up with a whole set of schemes to turn one-off customers into regular repeat customers, but also to make Moss Bros this kind of desirable, almost lifestyle brand. And one of my favorite things that they do is they produce this series of little books and pamphlets that they send out. And these are really colourful and fun publications, and they don't directly promote what Moss Bros is selling. What they promote is a kind of lifestyle that you might aspire to if you're a Moss Bros customer. So they are things like this publication up here called The Social Roundabout, which explains lots of key events in the British social calendar. So things like the opera at Glyndebourne, the races at Ascot. You can see this page here for Hunt Balls, and it explains all the different clothes that you might need to wear if you are going to go to these events. And these booklets are highly illustrated. As I said, they're fun to read, and they're the kind of things that you might pop on your bookshelf and keep. And at the end, very discreetly, they just have details about Moss Bros and the local store that you might want to go to and how to get in touch with them. So they're just kind of very gently embedding themselves in the way people think about British fashions and society fashions and dressing. So they're just kind of making some very nice, subtle connections. Lucy, do you want to tell us a little bit more about some of the other great marketing that they do?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what Bethan has made clear is just how ubiquitous Moss Bros were becoming. They were present all over the UK on the British high street. And I would say it's not a stretch that for, the last sort of 50, 60, 70 years, there are very few people in Britain who won't be aware of Moss Bros, because if you didn't see it on the street, you were getting the marketing materials, you were seeing the adverts, you were hiring from them. They are a real sort of cornerstone of British fashion, even if there have been trends in how sort of desirable and aspirational they have appeared. And this is one of the booklets that they put out to sort of mark a big milestone in the Moss Bros journey. This is from 1960, and it purportedly celebrates 100 years of the business. One thing we should say is that within the Moss archive, there are there's a fluidity, I would say, in the starting date of the business. So they sort of sometimes the commemorations don't always line up exactly, but this one, 1960, commemorating 100 years of Moss Bros, and they commissioned artists to make these incredible artworks, and that was really what helped elevate this sell that they were doing through marketing materials. And these are a particular favorite of myself and Bethan. And particularly this image from the inside on the right, which has this lovely image of the very famous Covent Garden headquarters store, the flagship store, with the side of the shop sort of blown open so that you can see all the different departments inside and subtly get this hint at the different lifestyles Moss Bros can fit into. So when you look closely, you can see there's tailoring, there's uniforms, there's a woman in a wedding dress, and then there's the saddlery department. So it just speaks to that range. And the cover, of course, represents that breadth of the country that Moss Bros was embedded into. And it wasn't just the marketing materials and the hire service that could reach you in your home. They also offered mail order. And this was another really important part of the business for those customers that couldn't maybe get into the city to come to the shops in person. And another way of just kind of infiltrating the Moss Bros company into part of people's life. And they were really crucial in what they could offer at an accessible price. Through the 1950s, the mail order business really expanded into the accessories, that kind of equestrian country life side of the business. And the leather goods were a really, really important part of the business. And we do have this lovely pair of boots, which are in the Museum of London collection, that date from around 1948. And I think they're a really nice example of what Moss Bros did. You know, they are so classic, they are so ageless. You know, when we actually found them, before we looked up the date, it was quite hard to hazard a guess at when they were from, because Moss Bros is still going today and producing quite similar products. What's really nice about these boots are they would have come from that kind of saddlery department, but they actually were worn by somebody who was an ambassador. It was part of his ambassador's uniform. He was the ambassador for Czechoslovakia, representing Britain. So it's quite an interesting insight into who a Moss Bros customer could be. It could be anybody, because they just knew exactly how to navigate kind of class and culture.
So we've talked a little bit about how good they are at kind of envisaging how the fashion industry is changing and responding to that. But Harry Moss also oversaw a real culture of valuing staff. And when we were going through their archives, one of my personal favorite things that we found were these fantastic staff magazines called Bits of Moss. Brilliant, brilliant title. And what you can really see through these magazines is the importance to Harry Moss of recognizing the work that went on behind the scenes and celebrating it, but also supporting staff development to make sure that you had the best people in roles who were continuing to work there. I particularly love in these staff magazines the personalities that come through. So we get a real sense of the fact that a business like Moss Bros that has all of these branches, all these departments, requires lots and lots of different people. And all of these people bring something special to it. So I said, these magazines are full of these kind of wonderful images and snapshots of people's fascinating lives. You know, we find out that Lucille Sargent, who is a needle hand in the bridal hire department, actually also has a whole career as a kind of amateur ballroom dancer, and that gets celebrated. So we get a real sense of, as I said, the fact that to run a business like this requires having this kind of big extended family and workforce family. What we also get from these staff magazines that I find very touching is glimpses of Harry Moss kind of navigating his identity as a Jewish man who's very active in his faith, active in his local synagogue and in different Jewish community groups, but also operates within the kind of Anglo-Christian norms of British society. So we see, for example, Harry Moss wishing all of his staff members a happy Christmas. And, you know, we see these kind of special Christmas editions of the staff magazine. We do not see the equivalent for Jewish holidays, but it's quite interesting to see how Harry Moss, in order to be successful in British fashion at this time, has to think about how he is kind of navigating those different identities as a member of the upper echelons of British society and also a man with active Jewish faith. Lucy, do you want to tell us a bit about the kind of wider cultural influence of Moss Bros?
Yeah, so I think as I was just saying, you know, Moss Bros is a real sort of cornerstone of British culture, really, really recognizable. And I think what's really interesting is how they reached that goal. And it was their really clever marketing and advertising and the way they placed themselves. And I absolutely love this photograph, which represents this really beautifully. So this photograph is by Bob Collins, part of the Museum of London's photography collection. It just happens to capture this Moss Bros billboard in Liverpool Street Station, which is a key commuter station in East London. And this billboard sort of looms large over the commuters. The name of the photograph is 6:15, commuter time. You're going home from work. And it perfectly captures the Moss Bros target market, which is sort of affluent, middle-class, working city people who would be aspiring to spend their hard-earned wages on sort of leisure activities and special events. And that is what the company could dress them for. So that is how Moss Bros pitched themselves to their customer. And for most people today, if you say the words Moss Bros, they will most likely say, I hired a Moss Bros suit for my wedding or a wedding, or maybe to go to the races. So it is about that kind of leisure activity life. But they were so good at positioning themselves around the city. You know, they're really part of the culture of London. They showed at all of the kind of equestrian fairs and events. And this is an extraordinary piece of marketing. So this is actually the ticket hall at Leicester Square Tube Station, one of the busiest stations in London. And certainly if anyone going to the theatre, you know, engaging with the culture of the West End, this is a station they probably come through. And if you go there today, you'll see there's still this roundel in the middle of the station, although sadly it is no longer used for Moss Bros advertising. And here they're advertising wedding hire, uniforms, you know, just the things that will kind of slot into people's lives when they need them most. But it just shows how familiar a presence they really were. And yes, here we have the most wonderful example of the wedding hire service. This is really the thing that most people know Moss Bros for. And it was once I think actually the hire service for men's wedding attire is really what made them realize that there was a great market here for women also. So they started hiring out wedding dresses. And again, it's not just the garments that they're offering, it's also the intel. It's what you need throughout the day, how the day should run, what each member of the bridal party should be wearing, what the groom should be wearing, what the best man and the page boy should be wearing. They had the information as well as the garments, and they came as a package deal. So this is a really special example of Moss Bros, and it really kind of ties up both who they were as a company and their heritage with who they were marketing to and how they marketed themselves. So this suit dates from the 1960s, and it belonged to a man called Helmut Feistburger. He was a German Jewish refugee who left Nazi-occupied Germany in the 1930s and came to London. And he has spoken of the awareness he felt of being an outsider, that the clothes he brought with him weren't quite right for life in London. He was always a little bit too hot or a little bit too overdressed. And with time, he acclimatized, and he actually really was a real Anglophile, and he was sort of described as always wearing a double-breasted suit and a monocle, and, you know, but it's very interesting that Moss Bros is the kind of company that he went to, because we know that they understood that idea of if you don't feel quite acclimatized, they could offer you the information that you needed in order to do so. So Helmut Feistburger, you know, was such an extraordinary cultural person. He became chief cataloger at Sotheby's, you know, had a real impact. But it really speaks volumes that Moss Bros is a company that he chose to wear.
So we've talked a little bit about how important Moss Bros is in terms of sort of mainstream British culture, but perhaps some of the more surprising things that Moss Bros have contributed to is British counterculture as well, particularly in the 1960s. And this is possibly one of my favourite things that we discovered while we were researching about Moss Bros, because it's one of the things that I least expected to discover. And that is the connection between Moss Bros and one of London in the swinging 60s most infamous boutiques, I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet. So I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet is a boutique that started out life on Portobello Road, selling vintage clothing, particularly military uniforms. And a Moss Bros employee called Manny Silverman, who was a guy who was originally from the East End, was one of those people that Harry Moss found through those boys' clubs. And Manny Silverman has very fond memories of Harry Moss, because he does remember Harry Moss perhaps giving him a second chance when nobody else would have done. But that was rewarded massively, because Manny rose through the ranks at Moss Bros and became incredibly important there. But one of the things that he was really instrumental in is making this connection between this boutique, I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet, so very countercultural, very subversive, and Moss Bros, because Manny was walking past I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet, and he thought about the fact that Moss Bros had an enormous number of out-of-date military uniforms. So of course, every time the military updates its uniforms, all of the stuff that you have to hire out becomes superfluous to requirements. You can no longer hire it out to military personnel because they're now wearing something different. And Moss Bros had a huge warehouse of this out-of-date surplus military gear. And Manny uses his connections. So his brother-in-law is the owner of another very trendy London boutique called Lady Jane. And he uses this connection in order to facilitate a deal that helps I Was Lord Kitchener's Valet massively expand. And I love this story because I think all of the very, very trendy young people who are shopping at Lord Kitchener's Valet would never in a million years have expected that some of the items that they were buying there came from a Moss Bros warehouse.
So we're going to wrap up in a moment, but I thought it was important to update you on where the Moss Bros company is today. Moss is still a very important part of the British High Street. They have rebranded just last year to Moss, so they've temporarily lost the Bros, but they've been through so many changes over the years. This really feels in keeping with the company history. Sadly, the flagship store in Covent Garden closed in 1989, but there are still around 105 Moss branches on UK high streets. So still very much around. And one thing that's really interesting is the hire service, which has always been part of the company, continues to be a huge part of the company. And now they have somewhat rebranded it as a sustainable choice, which is absolutely as it should be, because hiring clothes is a much more sustainable option in many ways. And it's really interesting that other companies are now coming around to the Moss Bros model of hire. So it shows just how forward thinking they have been over the years. So this is just a little tiny sneak peek of one of the Moss Bros displays within the exhibition. These photographs are from when we were installing the exhibition back in September, and one of our brilliant technicians, Matt, there putting in the objects, because I know a lot of you won't be able to see the exhibition, although it does run until July. So if you're in the UK, please do come and see us. But yeah, it just gives you a little flavour of the assortment of objects that we've brought together. And a number of the objects are on loan to us from the Moss company, and they were so generous in giving us access to their company archive, which was so valuable. So that's it from us. As you can see, we have the flyer for the exhibition, which has just been extended. So we've got an extra few months on our run until July the 7th at the Museum of London Docklands. And then there's the book that we've published with Philip Wilson Press, Fashion City, How Jewish London Has Shaped Global Style, which contains all of the stories of the exhibition. And the finale of the book is the Moss Bros story, because we loved it so much as a way to talk about the impact, but also the legacy of Jewish fashion makers in London. So thank you very much for joining us today.